it it does kind of breathe in the sense of that it actually is kind of decomposing in that it's like it's using oxygen and then it's giving off CO2 in the same way that like we breathe in oxygen and then we breathe out CO2. So we think of plants as kind of doing the opposite through photosynthesis, where they're pulling CO2 in from the air and then kind of releasing oxygen. And that is the case for leaves and active kind of like growing plant tissue. But when you have the fruit off, the fruit, when it's not attached to the plant, does the opposite. So it's using oxygen and off gassing CO2. And that's important to know, and we'll kind of come back to that later. And then just a few other kind of like terminology, because you'll see some of this terminology thrown around a lot if you're trying to read information about when stuff is ripe or when it's mature or when it's ready to pick. So there's kind of three kind of categories here. So the first is mature, and what mature means in the sense of fruit is mature is the stage that will ensure ripening after the fruit is harvested. So that can mean the fruit might not be at optimal maturity or ripe, but it means that if you pick it, it will ripen. Versus like if you pick an apple when it's this big and green and you pick it, it's not gonna ripen. It's not gonna get to maturity off the tree. But if it's just a little bit green and you pick it, it might still ripen. So that's what mature means. Is it just means it's reached the stage that it can finish ripening even if it's removed from the tree. Optimum maturity is the point of maturity when the fruit has reached its best quality for harvest. So it's really when you ideally would want to be harvesting if you have that option. And then ripe is the point where the fruit will start to deteriorate afterwards. It's kind of like, it's matured, it's kind of reached its peak, and beyond that, it's going to start decaying. It's going to start becoming overripe. It'll start rotting. It'll start getting soft, mushy, kind of start its downhill decline. And so just kind of the difference between those terms. So then when to harvest is you need to know when is it mature. And there's different levels to kind of figure this out. There's different ways to figure this out. So the first one is just a very kind of broad sense. And this can be helpful just to know when you need to start paying attention to your trees. So like this is just a chart that we use sometimes that gives a general idea of when like cherries would be ready. So you can see on this chart, cherries are usually ready sometime in June or into early July. So, that's a pretty broad window, but it does narrow down when you need to be focusing on it to, a 5-6 week period versus a 12-month period. So kind of looking at a chart like this can kind of tell you, well, if I have raspberries, then I'm probably going to need to be looking sometime in this window. If I have, blackberries, I'm going to be looking sometime in this window. And it gives you the kind of the cue to know when you need to start looking for the finer clues to know when your fruit is ready to be picked. And then this is kind of a next level down. So especially with some fruit, there can be pretty wide variations in when individual varieties can be ripe. So like blackberries, for the most part, are all kind of ripe within the same, month or so. I mean, they can vary, but most blackberries are going to be ripe in July, around the July window. Whereas, like with apples, there's some apples that can be ripe in mid-July, and there's others that aren't ripe until mid-October, and everything in between. So knowing what variety you have can help narrow that window down for you. So you're not having to pay attention from mid-July to mid-October to know whether your apple is mature. And strawberries are just another example. There's different types of strawberries. You can see like there's ones here that there's 3 separate times in the year when they're ripe. There's these where there's 2 times. There's this one where it's just 1 time, and those are just varietal differences. So just knowing kind of what you have can really help you to figure out when you need to be picking fruit. And then it's also important to know whether the fruit that you're going to pick needs to ripen on the tree or whether it can ripen off the tree. So, because there's some that, it needs to reach that full maturity and ripeness on the tree. Like if you pick it off before it's at its good flavor, it's just not going to ripen. It's not going to get that optimum maturity off the tree. And there's some that do. Um, and so this is a general kind of list here in terms of, you know, things like Asian pears, pretty much all berries like blackberries, raspberries, service berries, blueberries, currants, gooseberries, all those kinds of things. Stone fruits like cherries, peach, plums, most, you know, nuts, figs, grapes. Those are all ones that, you know, you don't want to be picking early really and then letting them, you know, try and ripen on your counter. For the most part, they really need to kind of reach that optimum maturity on the plant, on the tree, the shrub, the cane fruit, the vine, whatever it is. Um, and then there's other things that will reach that optimum maturity and ripeness off the tree just fine. Those are things, especially like European pears, um, a lot of apples, but especially later maturing apples, persimmons, strawberries, quince. So those are all things that can ripen as long as you know, don't pick them when they're real tiny and small. But like if you're not 100% sure on when exactly they're ripe and you pick them a little early, it's fine. So then knowing like for sure when to pick like an individual fruit, like if you're like, all right, it should be, you know, around now, and you're out there looking and you're trying to figure out, but you know, is it today? Is it tomorrow? Is it a week from now? How do you know? And usually the best ways to know is just use your five senses. You know, does it look right? You know, is it the right color? Is it you know, has it like some things are like shiny before they're fully ripe and then they get kind of dull whenever they're fully ripe, like berries sometimes do that. You know, is it does it look nice and plump? Does it you know, does it look healthy? Um, you know, does it look like it's supposed to when it's ripe? Is it also, you know, roughly the right time? You know, are you kind of in that window? You know, if you're a month early, sometimes that happens with fruits that it can be really early, but usually if you're like a month early, probably means it's not time yet. Uh, a big one is, does it separate easily? Um, so this is, you know, if you're going to pick a berry and you're having to like yank on it and the you know and you're like bending the branch trying to pull the fruit off, it's not ready. Like the plant still wants it. Um, Usually when things are ripe, they come off pretty easy from the plant, especially berries. You know, you can almost, you know, apply very little force, just kind of pull it just a little bit and it'll just pop right off if it's like fully ripe and mature. And then taste it. You know, does it taste right? Does it taste good? Does it taste sweet? You know, if you eat it and it's like really bland or it's tart or the texture is not right, it's probably not ready. And so, you know, it's not going to hurt to go out there, you know, every day, every couple days, whenever you're not exactly sure, and just taste them. And if it doesn't taste right, wait another day, wait another 2 days. Um, and and if they're ready, then go ahead, pick them. One kind of exception to this rule, because there's always exceptions to rules, it seems, at least in the plant world, um, is European pears. So European pears ripen kind of from the inside out, is kind of people usually describe it. To the point where, you know, if you wait until it's kind of soft on the outside, you know, usually fruit before they're ripened will be pretty hard. Like a peach is a good example of that. You know, like an immature peach, if you go to the tree and you kind of, you know, grab it, it's like rock hard. You know, it's not a peach, as you would want to eat one. And then when they get ripe, they've got, you know, just a little bit of give to them. They're just a little soft. Whereas pears, if you wait until they have that little bit of give on the outside, they're usually not very good anymore. They usually are overripe at that point. So really for those, what you want to check for is does it separate easily? That's really the cue for European pears, because they're still going to feel pretty rock hard, um, even when it's time to pick them. You know, if they're falling from the tree, like if you got a bunch falling from the tree, probably means you kind of missed the window a little bit, or you need to make sure to pick what hasn't fallen yet, and get them off the tree and start eating them. And if you get them at just the right time, which, you know, you're probably going to be late, at least the first couple of years, as you're trying to figure it out. But if you pick them at just the right time, usually what they say is, you know, if you pick them and then you set them inside kind of on the counter, they'll be like perfectly ready to eat, like right where you want them in about a week, kind of at room temperature. And what I say by, easily separating is a way to check that is if you have the pear kind of like this person is holding it, and then you kind of turn it. Usually if you kind of turn it, the stem where it's attached will just pop right off. It'll just pop right off the tree if it's ready. Like if you're yanking it, it's not ready. So just and that works for a lot of fruits that have those little stems. Apples, pears, Asian pears. If you kind of pick them up and kind of twist them a little bit or kind of turn them to the side, and the stem just kind of pops right off, they're perfect. They're ready to be picked. So then, how to harvest? So I mean, kind of like I just said, kind of that lifting the fruit and then twisting it, especially when you're talking about apples and pears. Is really good, and you don't want to yank on those, especially for your apples, because apples have these, or not all apples, but most apples have these things called fruiting spurs. So like when you see a picture kind of like up here on the right, or if you pick your own apples and you have that where there's that little bit of stem right there in the leaves, like how people draw apples, that's actually indicative that you did it wrong. So it's kind of funny that we draw that as the perfect apple, because it's actually a bad way to pick apples. Because what that does is that little piece of branch, it's called a fruiting spur, and that fruiting spur can keep producing apples for like 7 years or so. So when you break that off, you got that one apple, and then you just gave up 6 years of apples from that branch that could have kept producing apples for you. So if you're having to pull on it and the branch is breaking, it means it's not ripe. And so that lifting up and twisting a little bit, or moving it to the side where it'll pop off, you're not going to be damaging the branch that way. And that's the best way to do it. And it also tells you that the fruit is going to be good, that it's going to be ready to be eaten. And then, I mean, really with all fruit though, you don't want to be having to pull it really hard, because again, it probably means it's not ready to be picked. But also, I mean, not just fruiting spurs on apples, but it also means that you could be damaging the tree or the branch, of whatever it is you're harvesting from. And you don't want to do that, because you want your trees and your bushes and your vines to be healthy so that they keep producing fruit for you. So you want to pull gently. And this is just a picture here too of raspberries. So raspberries are another good example to kind of know, if you pick a raspberry, they're very delicate, very soft. If you're trying to pick them and you're smashing the raspberry to get them off, it means it's not ready. So I mean, you think about how delicate raspberries are. They should be they'll just pop right off just with kind of a gentle pull, and it'll leave behind this little kind of white piece, which is why raspberries are hollow on the inside, is that's supposed to stay behind. If you're pulling the raspberry and that's coming with it, again, means it's not ripe. Blackberries don't do that. They're not hollow on the inside. So you're not going to leave behind this little thing. But for raspberries, that shouldn't be coming with it. If it's coming with it, it's not going to taste very good for you. So then, just in general with harvesting, kind of a lot of the same. You want to be gentle, not only because you don't want to hurt the plant, but you also don't want to hurt the fruit. Fruit is relatively delicate. It's got a lot of water in it. It can bruise easily, smash easily. And so when you're picking, especially if you're picking a lot, if you're putting stuff in a bucket or a bin or something like that, you want to be gentle with it. You want to place the fruit. You don't want to drop it. So not like this picture down here where you're just tossing a bucket. And I imagine they're making wine or something, so it doesn't really matter. But assuming you're picking fruit to want to eat it fresh, you don't want to be doing that. You want to be placing them gently, and you don't want to be stacking them on top of each other too much. If you've got a 5-gallon bucket, you don't want to fill a 5-gallon bucket with raspberries, because you go a couple inches down, those raspberries are just going to be mush. So it varies from fruit to fruit. Like things like Asian pears and apples and European pears are tougher than things like raspberries. But just in general, you want to be delicate with them, because the least amount of damage that it has, the longer they will store. If they've been bumped around a lot, if they've got bruises, if they've got damage to the fruit, they're gonna go bad more quickly. It's also ideal, if you have the option to harvest in the early morning. They usually say kind of like right after the dew has kind of dissipated from the plants to kind of pick those, that's like the perfect time. But harvest them when you can. If you can't go in the early morning, that's fine. Pick them whenever. But harvesting in the early morning is usually when they're going to kind of be the plumpest. They're going to store just a little bit longer if you do that. So then once you harvest it, then what do you do? How do you store it? How do you preserve it? Which is an important question if you're growing your own fruit. Because if you go to the grocery store, you might buy a pound of apples, couple pound of apples. If you have a full-size apple tree, we're not talking a couple pounds of apples, we're talking 50, 100, 200 pounds of apples. And that's a lot of apples. So you got to figure out, what am I going to do with this? And it really depends on what you plan on doing and how much you have. So, like I said, with an apple tree, I mean, you could have a significant amount. Whereas, if you're talking about, I've got, one little patch of raspberries, that's a total different story. So, is the amount that you have, is it enough that you can just eat it all fresh? Do you want or need to preserve some of it? How do you want to preserve it? Are you going to be dehydrating, canning, freezing? All of those are going to kind of determine what you're going to be doing next in the process. But no matter what your goal, you want to cool it down kind of as quickly as possible. And that's another one of the reasons why picking in the early morning can be a little better, because it's usually kind of the coolest time of the day. And so there's less cooling that needs to happen to the fruit. And this is, an example I give too, when I say like harvest in the morning, if your only option to do that is to like go to your community orchard and pick in the morning and then the fruit sits in your car all day, then the morning is not good. It's just whenever you can pick it and then cool it down the fastest is the best time to do it for you. So the reason that you want to cool it down is because, like we talked about at the beginning, remember that the fruit is respiring. It's taking in oxygen and it's letting off CO2. So what that means, since it's not eating anymore, it's not an animal, it's not a person, it means that that's essentially decomposition that's happening. It's breaking those sugars, those compounds in the fruit are breaking down and off gassing as CO2. And the fruit respires at 10 times the rate at 60 degrees than it does at 32 degrees. So if you're thinking about this as decomposition, this is breaking down that's happening, the faster you can cool it down, you're going to see much, much longer storage potential for that fruit. So there's been, a couple studies, particularly on apples, to try and figure out best storage for apples, and they're pretty shocking numbers, really. And that at 70 degrees, which again is, especially when you're talking about picking stuff in the summer, is pretty cool. There's not many times in July and August that you're going to get 70 degrees outside. But at that temperature, and in your house, it's a little low for room temperature, but some people have their homes at 68, 70, so it's kind of right in that range. Apples at that temperature will reach ripeness, will reach that point, remember, where after, like, once you get to ripeness, everything's downhill from there. So it's going to get that final optimum maturity, reach ripeness within 3 days at 70 degrees. Whereas at 30 degrees, it takes 30 days to ripen. So, again, if you're just thinking, even 12 hours in that window, would take away, 1/6 of 30, whatever that is. So it'd be days that it would be taking off, if you're delaying how long it's taking you to cool that temperature down on the fruit. And the 30 degrees, you think like, oh, it'd be frozen at that point. But because apples have a lot of sugar, and this is the case with, pretty much all fruit has a lot of sugar in it, sugar acts as an antifreeze. And so apples don't actually freeze until you get into kind of around 28 degrees. So at 30 degrees, they're not actually frozen. It's just, and which is why they usually say 30 degrees is kind of as low as you can get before you start getting into freeze damage, depending on how much sugar is in your apples. And, in kind of ideal situations, so, if you've got a thing where you can set up, 30 to 32 degrees and have really high humidity, things like Jonathan, Golden Delicious, and Red Delicious can store for 3 to 5 months. So again, just getting that temperature cool is going to greatly extend how long you can store that fruit. So how do you cool it down? Most of us don't have big walk-in coolers at our house. So if you have something like a root cellar, lucky you. That's great. It helps with growing all sorts of stuff. But if you have a root cellar, root cellars are best, and that's because root cellars are cool, but they also tend to be really humid. So it can really help prolong storage. But you can also put it in a refrigerator. If you're going to do that, it's best to have it in a produce drawer. And the purpose of produce drawers is that because they're contained, they stay more humid, because the air in refrigerators tends to be really dry just because of the compression cycle that's used to cool the air, also dries the air. You can, if you don't have space in your refrigerator, you've got way too much, just as cool as you can and as humid as you can find it. So, even a basement, in your garage, in a cooler, under your counter cabinets, just, wherever you got, that's going to be as cool and as humid as you have available to you. And also, just as an example, of things that you could do if you get like real into it. I know there's people out there where they'll buy an old like chest freezer, and you can actually get little kind of attachments for chest freezers that you can find online, where you can regulate how cold it is, so it doesn't have to be frozen. Like you can raise the temperature up to 30 degrees. And I know some people who they've done that, and they have a chest freezer that is just for storing apples and pears. And it works great. They put them in kind of crates like this, stack them full of apples and pears, and they eat them, all winter long and into the spring of the next year. Because, like we had in that last slide, they can store 3 to 5 months, long time if you have kind of those ideal situations. So then, kind of once you've stored them, or as you're storing, as you're deciding kind of what to store and what to eat fresh, you want to be eating and using any damaged fruit first. So if you have an apple like this, although it doesn't look very nice, this whole other side is probably perfectly fine to eat, but it's not going to store very long. If you stick this in storage, even if it's like those ideal situations, it's still not going to store very long because it has this big, essentially, wound on it. So this would be kind of as you're deciding what to store, what to eat fresh. This should go in your eat fresh pile, or at the very least, go into storage, but you have it like in a separate bin so that you know to use it first, as you're kind of going through your stored stuff. And then you also do not want to wash the produce before you put it into storage. You want to wash it before you eat it. But there is like a protective, to some degree, like protective kind of microbiome kind of on the surface. And there's like natural like waxes and things. So actually, if you were to wash these apples like before you put them into storage, they're actually going to rot faster than if you didn't wash them. And so, again, rinse them off, wash them before you eat them, but after you take them out of storage, not before. And then anything that's in storage, you want to be regularly checking, like probably once a week at least, just to kind of just do a quick kind of visual inspection to make sure that there's not one like this that's going to be rotting. Because that the whole little cliche of one rotten apple can ruin the bunch, that's true. Like that that came from a real thing. Because those rotting organisms, those microorganisms that are creating the rot, if you have a rotting apple, they're proliferating there, and they can easily then spread over to the other apples, and can make them rot more quickly. So you really want to be checking, and if you see one that's starting to get a rotten spot on it or starting to look bad, pull it out, and that's the one that you're going to be eating today, or throwing it away if it's too far gone. So then actual, preservation. So, if you're not thinking just, how do I eat it fresh or store it to eat it fresh over a longer period of time, there's also, the cases of preservation. And for many fruits, if you're not able to eat them fresh, this is really your only kind of option. Like you can't really put peaches in a crate and put them in a root cellar and expect them to survive for 3 to 5 months. It's just not going to work. Or raspberries or figs or things like that. Those are much more delicate fruit. They're not really they're not really well equipped for storage, even in, refrigerators. They just don't last for more than a couple weeks. And some things like elderberries can even like start fermenting within hours. I had elderberries one time, even in the fridge, that they started fermenting with like in less than 10 hours. Um, and so if you want to make elderberry wine, that's great. But if you want anything else from your elderberries, you better be preserving them quickly. And for things like berries and stone fruits, you really need to have preservation. Luckily, there are a lot of different options for preservation, depending on kind of what your goals are, what your personal preferences are, what tools you have available for you, um, or at your disposal to use for these things. The main ones, though, are freezing, dehydrating, fermenting, and canning. So and this would be frozen, I believe. But kind of things that you can preserve. Sometimes you can kind of freeze whole fruit. Especially with berries. It's easy to freeze a whole blueberry or service berry or blackberry or raspberry, strawberry. Not as desirable to freeze a whole pear. But especially berries freeze pretty well as just a whole fruit. You can also do things like freezer jams. You can make things like jellies, things like purees. So just literally, cutting up the fruit, if it's got a pit or something, removing the pit and then just pureeing them, just blending them into a slurry essentially. Usually freeze really well, and then they can be thawed and used for other things later. Things like sauces, fruit sauces like applesauce, pear sauce, even things like peach sauce. You can experiment. You can make a sauce out of anything. Butters, so think like apple butters, pear butters. Those are usually the main ones that people do. I guess you could do a peach butter too, or I don't know, blueberry butter. But usually people like those fall fruits. They complement the spices better. But you can also do things more like desserts. Things like gelatos or sorbets. You can make a whole bunch of those and stick them in the freezer and eat them throughout the summer, throughout the fall. And even ice cream too. You can make homemade ice cream, flavor them with these fruits. And popsicles is another great one. You can make popsicles just out of puree. Like I've done that before when I just had way too many peaches. I just made a bunch of purees and just got some cheap little popsicle forms and just made a whole bunch of popsicles, and they were way better than anything from the store. And you can mix and match. You could put berries into the puree so that you've got kind of a popsicle with also some berries into it. There's lots of different options that you can do in that regard. Dehydration is a great way to preserve. It's probably the oldest form of preservation that humans have. Just drying stuff. Life needs water, so if you dehydrate these things down to where there's just not that much water in them, which also, especially in the case of fruit, concentrates the sugar. Sugar is also in some ways kind of toxic to microorganisms. It dehydrates them. The sugar kind of like pulls the moisture out of their cells, and so dehydration, where you're lowering that water concentration down, which kind of increases the concentration of sugars. Dehydrated stuff can store for a long time, as long as it's stored appropriately. And there's different ways that you can preserve fruit through dehydration. You can just dehydrate slices. If you have apples and you kind of core the apple and then kind of create little like donut kind of rings with them and dehydrate them. They're pretty good. Just little dried apple slices. This bottom picture here is jujubes, which is a fruit that not a huge number of people are familiar with, but we plant jujubes out at places. They're also called Chinese dates, and so they're really great dried, and they are just kind of like dates. You can make like a powder like this. Not exactly sure what you'd want to do that for specifically, but it could almost be like you dehydrate it and then it's already kind of ground up, and you could like rehydrate it into a puree, as like if you don't want to use freezer space potentially to like preserve purees. Fruit leather is another great way to use up a lot of fruit, and make it kind of shelf stable. And essentially this is a fruit roll up. except it's just fruit puree that you're dehydrating on, a baking sheet, on a piece of, parchment paper, or, wax paper or something. Um, and then you just kind of, peel it off that paper and just roll it up, and it's just 100% fruit roll up basically. They're pretty good, and again, very shelf stable. I've had them store. We have made like a huge batch when I had a big bumper year of apples or something, and had them store for years, in like a sealed container, and be just fine whenever I, went to eat them. If you're into fermentation at all, you can definitely ferment. I have not had much experience with this, but you can definitely make things like wines. Obviously, if you're growing things like grapes, that's always an option. But things like elderberries, even blackberries. You can make wines out of just about anything. You could also make things like fruit meads, so other kind of alcoholic beverages. You can make things like cordials and liqueurs, and vinegars. So apple cider vinegar is made from apples. You can make vinegars, and those can also be great to make kind of from the scraps. So like you can make apple cider vinegar from like the apple cores and the peels, and the stuff that you would be kind of tossing aside, um, as you're processing apples to dehydrate or to make applesauce, or to make something else. Another thing, especially for canning, although I mean some of these you could freeze as well, I guess. Things like juice. You can just, especially the apples is like kind of the classic one. You can juice apples or grapes, but you can also juice really just any fruit you want. And there's lots of different kind of juicing options. They have like kind of those mechanical, like plug in the wall juicers. There's things called steam juicers, which is the type of juicer I have. I particularly like it, which is like a stove top kind of setup that's got kind of a series of pans that you stick fruit in, and it kind of steams it, which breaks down the structure, and the juice just kind of falls down into a collection pan below. And by doing that, it's always being steamed until you remove it, so it's kind of sterile to go into the jar, and so the actual canning process is less cumbersome. Um, but you can juice just about anything and can it or freeze it, depending on kind of what kind of juice and what instructions you're able to find. um, Fruit salsas are another great thing. So this is like peach salsa up here. Mango salsas are something that people are more familiar with, but you can't grow mangoes here, but you can grow peaches, which are, a lot of times used in similar fashions. A lot of times they're used together. Peach mango is a pretty common kind of flavor combo. You can also make things like chutneys, which are kind of similar to salsas, but they're just a little different. You can make pie filling. So if you like pie, you could freeze or dry or something, sliced apples or whole cherries or something like that, or you could just make the pie filling and then can or freeze the pie filling, so that whenever you want to make a pie, you just take out the pie filling, just like you would buy pie filling at the store, and just dump it into the crust. Um, there's things called shrubs, which are, I don't know, I don't particularly like them, but some people really like them. It's kind of like a vinegar soda kind of thing, that usually have, um, like fruit in them, or can often have fruit in them as kind of a flavoring component. You can also just make soda, especially if you juice stuff. You can get one of those like, was it soda streams, or those like just carbonated water, and add them to some fruit juices and make kind of like carbonated juice. You can make syrups, boil down the fruit. Things like elderberry syrup are pretty famous. It's one of the like common ways that elderberry is used, but you can make syrups from other things, and use those later to make sodas, or for flavorings, or whatever you would want. And then I wanted to highlight a couple of resources here. So the first one is Stark Brothers. So what I like, or what they have that I like, is they have pretty good information on the harvesting, like the picking information of, how do I know when to pick my peaches? How do I do that? They have pretty good write ups on that. I'll reference those sometimes. Pickyourown.org is a great website that has some good like recipes on there for how to make canned peaches, or make strawberry jam, or a lot of that kind of preservation of things that you would get at like a pick your own kind of farm operation. They have some good instructions on how to preserve those. And then this last one here, homeorchard.ucanr.edu, is kind of an extension website out in California that has some good information again about kind of home, harvesting, preservation, good information along those lines. And that is about it. This is a shorter class, but I am definitely happy to answer any questions that anybody might have. Let's see, I say I don't. Yeah, so I'm not seeing any questions. So if anybody has them, you can throw those in there, and I'm happy to answer them. Or if not, then I guess we are done. And yeah, so thanks everybody for coming. If you think of any questions going into the future about this, don't hesitate to let me know. My email is dean@gatewaygreening.org. You can also just email our regular kind of just our info email. It does look like I have one question in here. Do you have any tips for using service berries? So honestly, my favorite for service berries is just fresh. I just love service berries. I just eat them by the handful. Is the main way that I use service berries. I also usually say though that they're really good for kind of any way that you would think to use blueberries. Is however you would use a blueberry, you can use a service berry in that same way. They kind of are relatively interchangeable. They also, I do know some people who have made kind of jellies and jams out of service berries, and they're good as jellies and jams. They're just at least in my opinion, what they really shine just as a fresh fruit. But you can definitely preserve them in any other way that you would preserve or cook with a blueberry in particular, but really any berry. They're pretty versatile fruit. So looks like somebody put a question in the chat. When you make apple cider vinegar, do you need to remove the seeds? No, or at least the couple times that I have done it, I have not. Because you kind of, and you can look up the instructions online, but you're kind of throwing it all into this into water, like into liquid, and you're letting it ferment. But then before you actually use the vinegar, you're then kind of straining out all the solids, so that the seeds aren't going to be staying in the liquid. So they can kind of float around in there, and they're fine because you're not going to be eating them or anything. So yeah, usually I throw like the cores, the peels, just kind of all of it in there, and you just kind of let it do its thing. But there's some good instructions online, some good videos that you can find on doing that. It's kind of a long process because vinegar it goes through like a fermentation to alcohol, and then it goes through a secondary fermentation into acetic acid, which is vinegar. So you're kind of like making hard cider, and then the hard cider gets made into apple cider vinegar. And then kind of once you're done with all of that, you're throwing out just all the cores and the peels and everything because they're pretty done by that point. So all right, well, yeah, looks like that is it. So I hope everybody has a good evening. Hopefully that was helpful. And again, if you think of any questions, just you feel free to reach out to us, and I am happy to answer them as best as I can.